welcome to Stork'd, the podcast where we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is your host, Julia Carroll, and today I'm really excited to introduce you to Eve Wiley. Let me start with a little bit of some shocking news. Did you know that in 42 states, it is completely legal for a doctor to inseminate you with sperm that you did not consent to use, including, by the way, his own? Yeah, you heard that right. You're going to hear from Eve, who is an advocate against something called fertility fraud. She is also the product of fertility fraud. And what I mean by that is that as a result of infertility, her parents chose a sperm donor. They took that sperm donor to their doctor, and the doctor decided without her mom's consent to inseminate her with his own sperm. And that's legal. Eve is working to change that. You're going to hear her incredible family building story, from discovering whom she thought was her biological father and building a relationship to him, to ultimately discovering it was her doctor, her mom's doctor, who was her father, and all the things that she's trying to reform in the donor conception industry and against fertility fraud. It's a really important listen. You're going to love Eve, and I am so excited to offer you this episode. If you like this episode as much as I do, as much as I know you will, please do several things. First, please share it with a friend who might enjoy it as well. Second, please subscribe to our newsletter so you can get great content on all things related to family building and family lives. And finally, go ahead and give us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This is Eve, and enjoy. Eve, I am so excited to have you here with Stork'd, the podcast, where we explore the many ways to build and define family. Would you mind telling our audience a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into all the meaty stuff you have to share?
All right. Well, I'm so excited to be here, and thank you for having me on. My name is Eve Wiley. I live in Dallas, Texas. I have 3 small children, ages 8, 6, and 2. And about 4 years ago, my story was uncovered about the truth of my genetic identity. And that really thrust me on a completely different journey in my life.
Let's go back 36 years ago. Tell us a little bit about how your conception came to be as you first understood it. And then we'll dive into what you later discovered.
Yeah. So my parents, they struggled with infertility. And I'm from a really small town in East Texas in rural America. There's 5,000 people where I grew up. So the closest hospital and doctor is 30 miles away.
Wow.
So at the direction of their fertility doctor, they looked into donor sperm and donor conception. And at the time, California Cryobank was and still is a really popular cryobank. And this doctor gave them a sheet of paper, and it had 1 line per donor, and it just gave the physical characteristics and then a few hobbies and a blood type. So just, it's not like it is today where it's like Mr. Prince Charming and looks like Matthew McConaughey. So it was just very limited information. So that's what they picked. And they picked a donor that was so opposite of my dad. My dad was tall, black hair, brown eyes. He was a calculus professor and liked tennis. They picked a donor who was 5'10", 5'11", blonde hair, blue eyes, interested in politics and religious studies. So just, it's interesting that they didn't value having that similarity.
Yeah.
So they circled 106 and wrote this one on it. And it took several inseminations, and then finally they had me. They were almost immediately pregnant, but this time it was with my father's biological child. So what we have concluded is that my dad, Doug, he had varicose veins around the testes. And so he had a reversal surgery. And it just took several more months than they initially probably thought for the vessels no longer to warm up the sperm. And then he was able to actually produce viable sperm. And then that resulted in my little sister. So I now have a little sister who's 14 months apart. And we are just total opposites in every regard. Really close, obviously as sisters, but just completely opposite. So that father, Doug, he passed away when I was 7 years old. And he passed away from a heart disease called cardiomyopathy. And at that moment, my mom, being a nurse, really was understanding the implications of, oh my gosh, I don't know about Eve's true medical history. And even though in the notes it said that I was only a donor, there were times that they were mixing the sperm with my dad's. So I think she kind of held on to that belief for a little bit that I was the biological child of my dad. But then looking at blood types and stuff, she was like, no, so she became really curious about that. And then she started this journey of trying to figure out, how do I get more information about Eve's medical history? Because my little sister was now having to go do heart echoes, and there were certain things that were in place for her. And she didn't want that forced burden to fall upon me, because I would, wrongly be believing that I should be worried about cardiac issues when those burdens aren't mine to bear. So she had enough understanding into that. So she started messenger groups. She started handwriting, and she kept records of all this. I mean, this green folder she has is this thick. It's insane. She would handwrite letters to California Cryobank. She would call them. And at the time, the protocol was, when the donor conceived offspring is 18, you can get the medical records from the doctor, submit them to us. We'll verify with the purchasing records of that doctor. And then we'll send out a letter to the donor, and then they can update their medical information. And so that's how it was.
Wait, so let me understand that. So it's only if you're 18, or at the time that you turn 18, at the request and sort of logistics management of the parent or the 18-year-old, could you then update medical records? We're not even talking about getting to know your biological parent. It's just, they're not going to update the medical records for 18 years unless asked, is what I'm hearing.
Correct. And that's what it was for me. And then again, just self-reported, if they could even find this person. What ultimately ended up happening is they were sending these letters of this, update your medical history. And the donor was just not responding. He was like, well, that's weird. Why do I need to respond? Like, there's no extra information of, there's a person on the other side of this. And then they also have to track the person down. So I went to my mom's fertility doctor, and with her permission, got her medical records. And that's the other challenge. What if you have a parent that won't give you the medical records to verify that purchasing? So there's so many kind of barriers. Fortunately, my mom was willing to do that. So we went through that whole process. I got them from her doctor, submitted them, California Cryobank. It took about a year, and they found him.
So this is about when you're 18. You're 18 years old. Okay. Prior to being 18, your mom started this medical search around 7, when your dad passes away, and she realizes that there's medical implications to not knowing your genetic history or medical history. Did you at 7 know that you were donor conceived?
I did not. My mom, at the time they were told, and this was, standard, don't tell the donor conceived offspring that they're donor conceived. It's not important. We know better now, but at the time, that is what they were recommending telling. There was no education. There were no support. There was so much of infertility, was that secrecy. There was so much taboo around it, and inability to effectively communicate, especially when it comes to a man and around his infertility. And those societal standards have fortunately shifted so much, but, that was the thinking at the time. And so, according to her, when I was 7, my father passes away. How do you explain that to a 7-year-old? I have an 8-year-old. I think it'd be hard for him to understand if I say, hey, that's not your real dad because you were donor conceived from another man, and in the middle of grief and all of this stuff. So I understand why she didn't tell me. It wasn't like it is now if you tell a child from, day one or when they're really little, and it's so normalized that it's just, a part. This is just how our family is. It was just different. And so she was collecting all this information. She says that she was going to tell me when I was 18. And that's what that green folder was for. She was going to give it to me. But I found out on my own. My mom she was our school nurse. And so I had the habit of going through emails. And it was either to maybe delete an email from a teacher that maybe I didn't make a good grade, I don't know, or to get some juicy gossip on my cohort. I want to know what's going on. I just didn't realize that I was the juicy gossip. And in there, I read the communication to California Cryobank. My first thought in reading it, because it was talking about sperm and, growing up on a farm, was that my mom was doing something with bull sperm for my grandfather. And then I saw my birth date and I was like, hold on, I got to make sure I have this right. And but I did. And it was late one night. So I waited to confront her in the morning. And I went in and said, Mom, I know Doug isn't my dad. And she just froze and didn't really know how to respond. And she just started bawling. And, my 16-year-old self, it's so interesting. 16-year-old Eve versus 18-year-old Eve versus 20-something versus now, right? Just how,
oh yeah,
and like our thing. But I was shocked, but also I was relieved because all those things that I had been thinking, like maybe I was adopted, maybe I was the product of an affair, all of those unspoken, unknown thoughts, this was the reason why I was thinking those things. And the truth alleviated all of those things that, I always knew there was a secret. I just didn't know that I was the secret. And so I also felt excited because in my 16-year-old Disney princess mind, I was like, oh my gosh, I have a dad. I don't really remember what it's like to have a dad. And I have a real biological father. And I can't wait to meet him. And maybe we'll go get a billboard in California and like put it up. And it could be anyway. It could be Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I mean, the whole thing through. But I did it. At that time, I felt excited. I was so naive to the complications. In my mind, it never occurred to me that my biological father may never want to meet me.
It's really interesting, the Disney princess that you talk about, because
No Disney princess.
first of all, every 16-year-old has these fantasies, right? But imagining this like somewhat naughty, kind of sly, like, oh, I'm going to go find some dirt in my mom's emails, who wouldn't do that, especially if your mom's a school nurse? And then switching quickly into the fantasy of what could be donor conception. And as a solo mom, I think there's a lot of fantasy around what solo parenting can be, right? There's this whole like, you can have any sperm you want and create the family of your dreams. And there's this romanticism of both of these things. It's just amazing how the way in which our teenage brains, as well as media, gives us perception that's not real about things like love, donor conception, parenting, solo parenting, all that stuff.
It's that focus on that happy ending, right?
Totally.
Like we are just going to focus on the positive and that toxic positivity that leaves room for larger marginalizations. And then whenever that expectation versus reality doesn't line up, we're like, oh my gosh, maybe I did something wrong. And it's internalized as maybe something's wrong with me.
At this point, at 16 years old, you discover the secret. There's some element of relief. There's some element of fantasy. My bio dad and I will be best friends. How did it shape your relationship to your sister? How did it shape your relationship to your mom? How did it shape the relationship you had to the memory of the dad who raised you until you were 7?
My mom did a really good job of keeping daddy's memory alive for us. The stories, the pictures, the home videos. She wasn't someone who, that's too difficult with grief and we're just never going to talk about that. She did a really good job of keeping that all together for us and really honoring his memory. With my mom, I think if anything, honestly made us a little closer. Not to say that it was always easy with her around this, especially later, but I could see through her efforts of trying to figure out my true genetic identity and donor and all of that time, just going through all the emails, talking to strangers and all the handwritten letters. Like she was spending so much time on this and I could see that effort. And that really meant a lot to me because it really countered that you have the secret about me you were never going to tell me. It was hard to be mad at that, right?
Right.
The biggest surprise through this within my family unit, I didn't expect how it would affect my sister. And I will never forget, we sat her down to tell her. And I thought she would be excited. I thought that she would just be like, whatever, like not a big deal. She started bawling and she just ran out of the room. And the only thing she said was, you still have a dad and I don't. It crushed me. I never even considered how she would have felt about this. And, again, we're young, but, her feelings are her feelings. And her internalization of this was drastically different because she felt like I had something to gain. And by getting a biological father, that door was still open for me and hers was closed long ago. That was hard.
Oh, man. And how do you guys relate now? Has it driven a wedge between you guys? Has it made you closer? Does it affect your relationship at all?
No, it hasn't. I think it was just, at that point, and then we just kind of grew into a new space, but it was never really brought up again. So, there could be some unresolved things, but I mean, we are so close. She lives an hour and a half away. We do almost everything together.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it's good.
Okay. So at some point, this fantasy, there's some wonderful blonde religious scholar out there in California who, when I meet him, is going to be my best friend, or we're going to build a new relationship, or at least he'll be a father figure of some kind that you had when you were 16, and the folder of data and information that your mom had collected. At some point, all of that flips. Can you walk us what happens from age 16 to now?
Yeah. So 18, cryobank tries to find them. It takes him a year. He calls. He's like, why do you want this information? I had written a letter and given to the cryobank and said, if you ever do get a hold of him or he returns anything, can you please forward this letter to him? And in that letter, it was your typical, like, I'm financially secure. I'm not a crazy person. I know this is weird. I don't know how to write this letter, but I'm your biological daughter. And, this is a little bit who I am. And here are some pictures. And so they gave that to him, and then he responded in an email to me, and then they forwarded it to me. And then I responded to the cryobank, and then, that was kind of the dialogue for a bit. And then we started moving to phone conversations, and then we cut out the cryobank in our communications. And then very quickly, he flew to Austin to meet me for the first time. And I mean, opening that door, it just felt so natural and so right. And he is the most warm person in the entire world. And just everything is just so welcoming. And he was so intrigued by this. And there was nothing off about it. I was just like, this is just how this goes. And he's so cool. And we really started this beautiful father-daughter relationship. Very quickly after that, I started calling him dad. I got introduced to his children, my half siblings. And then when I decided to get married, he officiated our wedding. And then now that I have kids, they call him Papa. We spend holidays together. We say, I love you. Like, this is dad. And it was that fairy tale ending. I felt, incredibly lucky to be able to have that. But
so in many ways, your 16-year-old brain was right. Your 16-year-old brain imagined a new relationship. And maybe even your sister's fear came true, that you got to have a dad that she didn't get to have in this beautiful blossomed relationship, which, by the way, I've talked to other donor conceived people, as have you, I know, and it doesn't always go that way. The fairy tale doesn't always evolve in that way. And yours didn't either. Yours changed too. Can you tell us what came next?
It did. So, I say, like every fairy tale story, there's often a dark twist, and that's how mine was. When we had my son Hutton, he's my firstborn. He started presenting with these medical mysteries, and our entire children's team in Dallas, they couldn't figure out why. He was vomiting every hour and a half. He had pyloric stenosis. We had a pylorotomy. He was kind of having food reactions, weren't really sure, but he wasn't eating real food. And at one point, one of the doctors was like, let's call it this nutritious, maybe it's an absorption issue. So we look at doing 23andMe plus health to get raw genetic data to look at absorptions and genetic blah, blah, blah. So we did that. And I had always known that the possibility, I remember the cryobank saying that Steve, dad, was a popular donor, but I was the oldest one. So I knew I was going to have half siblings, but I wasn't really focused on half siblings, and commercial DNA testing was new to me. I didn't really understand how to read the platform. And I was so tunnel vision with my son that I wasn't even really thinking about that part of my life anymore. So we get these results back, and it says that he has celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disorder. I had no idea what that is. And they're walking me through all this. It's hereditary. It's someone in your family has it. It's a gluten intolerance. And I'm calling, everybody in the family. I'm like, who has tummy issues? Like, I don't know what's going on. And no one. So then I'm looking at the DNA relative side, and I'm sure you're familiar with the platform, but it's not an exact science. So when something is like a half siblings in centimorgans, for example, it could also be a uncle or an aunt or a first cousin. It's those metrics can mean several different relationships. So a lot of mine were looking like first cousins. And Some of them were looking like half siblings. So we got Hutton all figured out. I talked to my half siblings. One of them is like 13 years older than me. And I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. But again, cognitive dissonance is an amazing thing because I know who our donor is. And then I called Dad. I'm like, hey, Dad, I have half siblings. Like, there's more of me out there. But I didn't want to be in the middle because I recognized that our relationship was not without complications and it was hard. It only worked because, it worked for us. And I didn't want my projection of what I think someone else's relationship should be projected onto half siblings. Because, for example, for me, my dad was deceased. So I didn't have that protective feelings toward a recipient parent, right? Especially the maternal one. And so I was like, Dad, take the 23andMe and then you'll have a platform to talk and then I'm not the middleman. So he's like, okay. So he took it. So to make a really long...
It's so interesting that I just want to acknowledge for a second how conscientious you're being towards his feelings, his needs, his relationships with people we've never met before. I mean, one of the things that is so unfair about donor conception is how much burden the donor conceived person has to take on managing the emotions of others, half siblings, their own emotions, full siblings, parents, bio parents, et cetera. And so what you're really doing is stepping empathetically in his shoes and getting worried for him about the relationship he has with people you've never met before. Right. It's amazing that you did that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you for acknowledging those complications of the burdens that do fall to the donor conceived person, because I think that that's something that is not widely accepted or validated because, it's not widely understood and it's easily marginalized in that capacity too. So talking through him, I end up connecting with one, and this dude's not on social media, but I find him on LinkedIn. And so I sent him a message and it's like late at night. And I'm like, hey, I think I'm your half sister. Or no, I was like, are you the Adam on 23andMe? And he's like, yes, who is this? And it's late. I was like, hey, we're connected. I want to explore, how we're connected. Can you give me a call? And he's like, well, I'm in bed. It may be difficult to explain to my wife why I need to get out of bed and go call another woman. Okay, that's totally fair. I just think I'm your half sister. And then immediately my phone rings and he's like, okay, you have my attention now. I was like, I'm sorry, just like dropping that bomb. But here I was thinking that I'm dropping this bomb on him. And I'm like, I'm your half sister. He is, and this happens all the time. He's like, no, he doesn't think he's donor conceived. So I'm like, okay, let's walk this. So I was like, great. Like now I'm the one having to be the messenger here to tell him that, that he's donor conceived. He's still like, no, I look like my dad. All right, well, let's just go through this whole thing. So we go back and we look at the connection and it says we could be first cousins. And so I was like, all right, well, if we're first cousins, then your uncle is my biological father. Is your uncle Steve Scholl? He was like, no, my uncle is Kim McMorris. And my world stopped. I was like, what? Kim McMorris is my mom's fertility doctor. And then both of us, you could hear a pin drop. Because in that moment, we knew exactly what that meant. There was no way that and everything made sense. The one that was 13 years older, all those red flags that I had been kind of ignoring because I was so sure that Steve was my biological father. And the truth was that Steve, donor 106, the sperm donor that my parents selected and consented to, was not my biological father. It was that my mother's fertility doctor inseminated her with his own sperm, and he was my biological father. And then I was faced with some very difficult choices because I'm
just going to pause for our audience to take that in for a second, because I know your story, right? We've been connecting. I've read everything you've written. And even when you say that, your parents selected and consented to a donor, and the fertility doctor made the decision without their knowledge to inseminate them with his own sperm. Even knowing your story, my stomach is in pits. Like I feel sick thinking about that. And you're saying that like your world stopped when you heard it. I'll let you continue. I just wanted to stop and acknowledge the feeling sensation I'm getting at the like lack of consent around this.
Well, and you probably, can feel that transference of, and anybody that's gone through infertility, we put so much trust into our doctors, the relationship that we feel with them, and to have them do something so violating and to insert themselves into our lives permanently, to taint what was such a beautiful and wonderful thing is so hard. And this is what was really hard for my mom. And I think this is why we see the advocates within fertility fraud. We are seeing the offspring. We are not necessarily seeing the parents. And this took a lot of therapy with my mom to really honor the trauma around this and saying that, Mom, you are allowed to hold space for that trauma. You're allowed to feel like a victim from this. You are also allowed to love me and wish that it would not be different because I'm your daughter. Because she felt like by saying, oh my God, I can't believe this happened, I hate this, it also meant that she wishes I wasn't her daughter. And that's not true. Teasing those things apart are really, really hard for our parents because they love us so much. And then also the emotions around, she felt like this was her fault, this kind of victim shaming and blaming. And, and it's a lot to really tease apart. But we were able to do that in a really healthy way, thankfully. But I did, I had a choice I either had to go tell her, and it was right back to that moment when I was 16 years old. Again, for the third time in my life, who am I? And all of these burdens that weren't mine to bear. And, all these forced sense of identities that I've been trying, and here I am. I have 2 small children at the time, and I'm starting over, and I'm like, who am I? And so I did. I made the choice, just like when I was 16. My mom was actually on vacation with us. And I ran upstairs. They were watching with my in-laws, Tanya. I'm like, Mom, I gotta talk to you. And then, they're all mad because I'm trying to talk to her. And I just blurted out, I'm like, Steve's not my dad. Kim McNorrie's is. And she's like, what? She could not process the information. I had to tell her over and I've never seen someone in shock. And she went into full shock. She was physically shaking. She couldn't believe it. He would never do this. He was such a good man. He's such a kind man. He's so respected in our community. She could not believe it. The processing that whole part of trauma too, when we really, and I think this is important, it's not just, like this robot or something inserting sperm, getting into the details of what artificial insemination in the 80s looks like. You have a woman that lives 30 minutes away. There are no cell phones. There are no beepers. If she's driving and gets a flat tire, that sperm is already thawed and then it may not work, right? So she has to drive, go into the office. The doctor preps the cervix for insemination. He goes into the next room. He masturbates to procure the sample, returns in under a state of arousal, digitally penetrates her, and deposits his semen. And when it's put like that, it feels more like a sexual assault, and I say that because a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. But our mothers say over and over again that they felt like they were medically raped. And that is very uncomfortable to think about. And it's very quick and easy to do a trauma Olympics compared to different forms of sexual assault. But it's also important to validate their experience and then to really cope with the truth of this 30-something years later. It's hard.
I think that's really important. And if we're going to compare it to my experience, I had a vial of something that was titled with a number, shipped to a doctor's office. There were several instances where I had to check the number on the vial. I had to check the number on the computer. It was a lot of moments of consent. And then the person who inseminated me using IUI, which is a similar process, was a female nurse practitioner. So it was as clinical and impersonal as could be. And that's the way it's intended to be. It's not intended to be somebody's going into a room next door, excited that he gets to impregnate somebody with everything save for penetration with a penis, right? It's what you just described is so close to actual penetrative sex that it's disgusting.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is. And then to have a man do this, and I mean, the donor sperm was there. Like, what was the point? And but to find out that this wasn't just once that this happened, that I now have, there's 13 of us, 3 are his social children that we know of. And he doesn't even know how many times he did this. He can't even give us an accurate number. So I don't even know the rest of my half siblings. So
I imagine you've done a lot of psychological processing. And the question that just keeps coming up is, you've described the how, but the why. Why would somebody do this? Have you uncovered any answers that feel satisfactory on the why front?
No. I mean, I think that, back then, it could be money driven. He was saving money. It could be
How was he saving money though? Because she had already purchased the sperm.
he just wasn't using it. He could be using that sperm on a different patient.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't have to buy more, saving on shipping cost. It could be this narcissistic thing. Well, why wouldn't someone want my sperm? Like, I'm tall, blonde, I'm a doctor. So it could be a God complex. I think a lot for him, when God fails, he is God. He gives them a baby.
Yeah.
I think there could be a personality disorder associated with it. I think it could be a lot of things, or just that he wouldn't get caught. He did think he'd get caught. So just why not? They wanted a baby anyway. Let me give it. I know my sperm works well. It's fresh too. So maybe it could be that he wanted to be the best doctor around, which he was. And these success rates were going to get him there. So, it could be all of those things could be true. I don't know. I do find it fascinating in talking to some of his former nurses. He ran this program for 3 years after they shut it down, when his nurses were helping him. They had no...
I'm sorry. What does that mean?
So his nurses were helping him run this program. They would prep the sperm. There were local donors. There were all this. There was an instance that happened where a donor didn't show up and they didn't have sperm. And so he went into a room, came back, and whenever he ended up giving the nurses the sperm, it was still warm. And in that moment, they knew what was happening. Yeah. She obviously didn't stay there much longer. And so, but she said the next few days, he was like, we're not doing donor insemination anymore. We're shutting it down. And then for 3 years after that, I have a sibling that was born 3 years after that. So he was still doing it. He just, at this point, wasn't using his nurses to prep the material.
That's amazing.
That's like just so wild.
So you have now had 3 inflection points, probably more, where your conception story may shape your self-identity. Maybe it's more. I mean, we all as adults, regardless of how we were conceived, have many points where we have to think about, who am I? What does this mean for me? So you've lost your dad, you discover your donor conceived at 16, you build a relationship with a new dad, and then you discover that your conception story was not as you expected. Did you feel a crisis of identity at any of those points? Did you evolve your sense of self-perception? How did those influence who you are now and how you think about who you are now?
Yeah, no, they absolutely did. I felt I think it's one of those things when you don't know your genetic identity and you're filling in information that exists in a vacuum, right? And it creates that fantasy.
Yeah.
And then to have such what I thought was such a beautiful, happy story and end up not being the truth. I did. That third one was, that was hard. That one was really hard. But now I have small children. And worse than that, there's not, I had connected with this donor conceived community and had so much support. There wasn't that for a donor deceived community. There were people that I could find that had the same situation. Eventually, I did find Jacoba Ballard, which is the Our Father Netflix documentary, but there wasn't a therapist that specialized in this. There wasn't a book. There wasn't a blog. There wasn't a movie. I felt like I was on an island and it felt really, really lonely. But on top of that, I was still protective of my mom's feelings and of my dad's feelings. And it was really hard to also process that my existence indirectly was causing people that I love the most a lot of pain. And that was hard to process too. Yeah. Right. That hurts. When you really want to get deep, it's, every time I talk to dad, is it hurtful? Is it, and the same thing for my mom, is it hurtful? And then when I decided to come forward with a story, like, whoa, it's one thing to really process and go through a really big thing behind closed doors. And without the world watching, it is a completely entire different animal to come forward and process and go through it with the world watching and the marginalizations. And my community that I grew up in, they were not supportive of me. They were supportive of the doctor. there was so much rape.
Explain that. Like, how can somebody say, you know what, this doctor did the right thing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's wild that they just wanted a child and they got one. He was doing the Lord's work by giving them a child. And you have a duty to honor your mother and your father. There was a woman that wrote to the Nacogdoches paper. It's on my Instagram. You have to go read it. It is wild. People posting on Facebook, the 2020 thing that a local organization posted had over 3,000 comments that were supporting the doctor. So many comments that Jody Madeira did a study on the comment section because it was so wild. But this man, he had a preacher come and talk to the congregation about how to support McMorris and this whole thing, but they were being fed very limited information, right? They're not going to pick up the New York Times. They're not going to listen to all different podcasts. And, this is rural America. This is one of their own. This is a tribe mentality. And I was the proverbial monster that was spitting into the eye of the tribal leader. This is, women are to be barefoot in the kitchen, and to challenge a man is not something that is socially acceptable. And I grew up essentially with a single mother. I was treated differently. And I say that because that is a small percentage. There are many wonderful, wonderful people that I grew up with. I mean, many. But I am focusing on that small percentage of just backwards thinking. And those are the ones that are going to come and make the comments for things. And yeah, I think a lot of it too is they have a connection to this doctor. He delivered so many of their babies, and these people have a wonderful experience with him in their community. So it is really hard to believe that good people can do bad things, especially when you know that person.
Absolutely. And especially we put so much trust into our doctors. We believe that they have so much knowledge, and it can be very scary to confront a doctor and tell them, I want to do this for myself, or my body knows better than your medical history, especially if it's a male-female relationship. So I can imagine saying, oh, he knows best, doctor knows best. How could anything he did be wrong? I can also imagine the comments, and I'm curious if you got these, you should be grateful you're alive. Does it matter how you got here kind of thing, which is
all the time.
That's got to be hard, right?
You wouldn't be here if he didn't do what he did. That one I get a lot. And, you should just be grateful to be alive. And it's like, why is being grateful the bare minimum here?
Right.
Why am I not entitled to know where I come from? Why am I not entitled to have my medical history? I don't think me striving just to be grateful. And I am. And again, that goes back to those opposite feelings. All of these things are true. I am grateful to be alive. I love my life. I recognize that I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. But I'm not talking about being alive. I'm talking about the deception around my conception. And it's really hard for people to tease those apart. And what I have found that, when people give those marginalizing responses to me, it is a projection of their uncomfortable feelings of what I've just said, instead of being like, oh my God, that is insane. That sucks. I'm so sorry. They say the marginalizing things, that toxic positivity part of silver lining, oh, but I'm so glad you're here type thing. But what it ends up doing is it ends up making me feel not heard, seen, or validated. Like, I just told you something that was really hard and you just focused on something that I wasn't even trying to say. And I think that, we are trying to be helpful listeners when that happens. That's just what we do. It's like when, someone passes away, it's like, oh, but they had a wonderful life. And, we're just focusing on, the positive with it. And it's like, no, I just want to sit in kind of like the mess of how much this sucks. But you're right. I do get that one a lot. Like, oh, you should be grateful to be alive.
Believe it or not, for a podcast about families, we talk about grief a lot. I mean, it shows up in so many different forms. It shows up in losing miscarriage, infant loss, losing a parent, losing a sibling, losing a loved one. But it also shows up in the life that you thought you were going to live and don't, whether it's infertility or whatever. And also, when your self-perception has to change or some information comes to light. So I imagine there's some grief with knowing that the conception story, the fairy tale way that you came to be, where your mom and your dad picked this wonderful donor and he turns out to be miraculous and kind and just so special, actually is a little bit dirtier than that,
And, you're hitting the nail on the head with that one. There is a lot of grief, and grief is so personal and it looks so different for everyone. And it's not a linear process. Some when I talk to people who find out that this is also their story, we talk a lot about how this feels like being in an ocean and the waves are just coming and going. And some days are good and some days it's a tidal wave. And, it's just not, healing is not linear for anybody. And there is, because I'm grieving the loss of, even though nothing has changed with Dad, Steve, Donor 106 in that regard, I'm still grieving that part. I'm still grieving that I had to make a decision that ultimately meant that I was never going to have a relationship with my real biological father. And that one's been really hard too, because I felt like this was not my information to keep, that if I had siblings that were struggling with health issues, they needed to know this. And that there's a grieving process with that, to not being able to know my 3 half siblings that are his social children. And so there's a lot of grief in all of this, grieving that my mom had to go through this and I had to be the bearer of bad news for it, and then had to publicly come forward with it while we were all trying to heal. But there's a lot of grief in a lot of ways.
Let's talk about your public persona for a second, because you've become this advocate, this lightning rod, this image for 2 things. And they're 2 very important things. One is the donor-conceived community. And the second is those people who are donor-conceived through fertility fraud is the term. I think you may have even coined it. Something interesting is happening in the world, which is that the quietness that we previously had around donor conception, hide it, don't tell anyone, throw it under the rug, is no longer present. And also, as fertility rates decline and more people are becoming solo parents or gay parents, donor conception is on the rise. So we're at this point where we're becoming more vocal. It's coming out of the closet. It's bursting forward into the zeitgeist of our nation. And you're in the center of all that. Can you talk to us a little bit about, how you define fertility fraud and how you want the world to perceive both donor conception as a whole and the subsector of donor conception, which was the seedy underbelly of how people are sometimes conceived?
Yeah. So, okay, hold on. That's a lot to unpack.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I don't know how to unwind it, because
I know it's a lot. I'm just gonna,
it's the same package. Let's take one at a time. So how does it feel to be this person who is in the center of the donor conception and fertility fraud world?
Sometimes it feels like a lot of pressure. It feels like, to your point, all of these things are coming to a head now, and it feels like an Instapot. And there's help to relieve any of the pressure. And I mean, honestly, I think the fertility industry is kind of thriving on that, because it's so distracting right here that they're still getting away with everything that they want to get away with. And so I'm going to back up, and just for your listeners, to kind of give a brief how I got here. How did I get to that point? After I discovered all of this, I actually called my attorneys and I was like, can someone walk me through this? Like, what, is there justice here? And the short answer was no. In Texas, I didn't have a civil cause of action or a criminal cause of action against the doctor. And the medical board, because of a statute of limitations issue, was not even going to be able to take his license, which is why he's still practicing today. So I went to the Texas legislature. We meet every 2 years. I think we were 20 something days in the session out of 140 something. And California at the time was the only state that had some sort of fertility fraud bill. And it had very limited language, like maybe this could kind of fit in there, but not. So I went every single week and I would spend 8 hours meeting with offices and legislators and saying, hey, here's my problem. I don't really have a solution. And there was one woman, Senator Huffman, and she created and crafted language for fertility fraud to make it a sexual assault. And we got it passed that session, which is very hard, but we did it. And then from that moment, when I was there, I was also, this is like when the 2020 episode came out and the Dallas Morning News article came out and all of that. And I was contacted by a few women in San Antonio, Texas. And they actually had the same story, but it was from a doctor in Colorado. And they came and supported me every step of the way and sat with me for hours and hours when I waited to testify every single time. And so after that, that was me really working through my pain. That was me, externalizing this. And I was, as shocking as my story was, the most shocking thing to me was that there was no legal landscape and that this wasn't a crime. And that was not satisfying. Me being able to, my only other option was to go sign a non-disclosure agreement with the doctor, keeping his reputation intact and everything else, and then walking away with money. And that is absolutely an option for a lot of people. That can be great for healing and taking time off for work and, therapy and things like that. But that wasn't, suffering in silence wasn't going to be my path. And
Mhm.
So from there, I started working in Florida, and then I started working in Colorado. And then it just kept going, more stories, more victims, and then empowering those victims to, this is what I did in these other states, and let's do this together. And in 4 short years, we've just collected all of these victims, and then we all jump into the next state and help. And then now we have 11 states. And
Awesome.
next week, I'm actually going to Washington, D.C., because we will now have a federal bill that has been filed. So I'm very excited about that part. So that's kind of how, the legislation part of.
And that's really important, because if anyone is thinking, I might be facing infertility and I'm going to use a sperm or an egg donor, I might choose to do solo parenting, I am a gay couple and I'm going to need an egg donor or sperm donor or whatever, you might say, oh my God, how do I protect myself from fertility fraud? And the answer is the work that Eve, you are doing right now is protecting all of us in our family building journeys to make sure that we have informed consent around whose biology we choose to be the parent of our children.
Right. And, the thing here is because of commercial DNA testing, I really don't believe that doctors are doing this today, but it's still really important because as of right now, this is the only reproductive issue that is bipartisan. It is the only thing that most Americans can agree on from any political stance here, that a doctor should not be allowed to do this. But when I go in and talk to a legislator, I'm doing more than talking about fertility fraud. I am talking about how unregulated this industry is. And I am talking about creating accountability within an industry so that things don't happen, negligence doesn't happen. For example, most people don't know that the ASRM, American Society of Reproductive Medicine, is a professional organization that gives guidelines. A doctor does not have to follow those. A sperm bank does not have to follow those. In fact, a lot of sperm banks don't follow those guidelines. A lot of people don't know that. So live births, for example, if a sperm bank says, we don't do more than 10 per family, that's not true. There's no way of tracking that. And if the ASRM says that you can have 25 offspring per 800,000 people, that means I could have 10,000 half siblings and still be biodiverse in a world where we are all so connected. Most people don't know that. There's such a lack of education with that. And then the medical information, it's self-reported. It's not validated. They're not taking criminal hits. Things that may change a person when they are selecting a sperm donor, when they are trying to responsibly build their family. Those are important things to know. And if you don't know the questions to ask, you just don't know what you don't know. And you think that a sperm bank is, doing those carrier tests and the genetic testing, or for example, 10% of them actually do psychological testing or counseling for a donor to be able to say, hey, when that child is born, it is going to grow up and will be an adult who will have desires and wants and feelings and may want to meet you. And this is how we recommend navigate that. There are so many, it is so tangled. And so very quickly, that fertility fraud was one thing, but then also being an ally to donor conceived persons and their advocacy and, really trying to shine a light in all the dark corners of the industry so that people who are using artificial reproductive technologies, people who have no choice but to have chosen family, are not being taken advantage of. And that is really important to me because we have 12.4% of the population that struggles with infertility. We have single mothers by choice. We have LGBTQ community. This is not a small percentage of our population that's using ART, but it's being done in a way that does not hold this industry accountable. And we are just evolving. Like family, there is a million different ways to have a family, and it needs to be done, one, with the people that we are creating, with them at the center of it. And we need to be doing things that are right by them so that they don't get marginalized and so that they don't have all of these various barriers in place.
It's amazing. Thank God we have you. So you've just said a lot of big things. Essentially, you just told us, the huge world that listens to this podcast, all the things that I am most afraid of as somebody who has used donor sperm, right? You just put all my fears on page. If you were to tell us in a couple bullet points, what is your platform? 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you have affected all the change that you want to make. What are the things that have changed?
It would be, I would like to see live birth limits. I think that would be a big one. I think it's really hard to navigate large sibling groups, especially when, people coming into those, it's hard to be rejected from a sibling, right? It's hard to keep all of that together because we're all just so different. So I think that would just make it easier.
Do you have a target number of live births that you think is appropriate for the donor conceived world?
10 is good. And I have 10. It feels like a lot, but I think that's realistic. That's my personal opinion. I'm sure there's, lots of, but also that's my personal experience too. But I think that's pretty consistent across what I've seen globally as well.
And 10 total, not 10 globally, which is one of the problems is that the sperm banks will sometimes say, oh yeah, we have live birth limits, but they mean in the US, and then they'll start shipping the sperm abroad. So you're saying 10 siblings globally is sufficient?
I think so. That's good because, again, we are so connected. So it's easy for me to FaceTime if I have a sibling in the Netherlands or in Spain. It's easy to kind of meet up now. And it's a lot to maintain as far as a person deciding, do they want that sibling relationship with their half siblings, or is it more of a friendly relationship? And, everybody's different. So I think 10 would be good. Accurate medical information, really verifying that medical information. Everyone's healthy when they're 18. I know that most 18-year-olds, they don't know how their grandparents died or great-grandparents died. They don't really have an accurate snapshot of that. A lot of the sperm banks will do 3 generations, but it's all kind of self-reported. So really kind of digging into that a little deeper. Better education on how to support parents, recipient parents, and then also donor-conceived persons. How do you navigate the connection and all of the complexities? Because, there are very unique circumstances, and there is a systemic problem within this industry that really feed that. So I think that that's really important to you. Anonymity, I think, is dead because of commercial DNA testing, but a lot of sperm banks still sell anonymous sperm. And so to me, that kind of feels partially because you can't control that donor's niece is going to take a DNA test and then they're going to figure it out. So, that just needs to be gone. And I think,
I agree. It's fraudulent not to the person who is purchasing the sperm and or using it to conceive, because we all know how the technology works, but it's fraudulent to the person that is selling the sperm. The donor is thinking, I'm anonymous. The gentleman at age 18 or 20 who is selling his sperm to a sperm bank is thinking, great, this is going to have no impact on my life. And that's just not true.
Right. But that also leads into my next one, higher age limits for donors. A lot of these sperm banks are around college campuses for a reason. It's easier to convince an 18-year-old than it is a 30-year-old. There could be some sperm count reasons why in there too, but an 18-year-old who doesn't have a fully formed brain until they're 25, can we really ask them to make a big decision like that? Like, that seems a little predatory in some ways. So I think that would be something, I would want to see change. And then permanent record retention rate. We have now, it's technology. Now it's not, warehouses full of paper. And so I think that is helpful for a donor conceived person, at least for the medical side. But I also find it sad when people are like, well, I just want to find them for medical reasons. Like, that also makes me feel sad because, we feel like we can't ask to know our biological parent, or that it's not right of us to have that, but it's our biological parent. And, and we do want more than just medical. Some of us do want more. Obviously I did medical.
Yes.
I think that talking about all of those things really opens up the floor for more dialogue about it. So we can have these stronger connections instead of it being this recipient parent versus donor conceived person, when really it's recipient parents and donor conceived persons against the fertility industry, because they are the ones that have the ability and the platform to make this better. They just don't.
A lot of the changes that you're recommending, the legislative changes, can lead to an increase in price for the sperm. In order to verify, I might need to do extra work as a sperm bank. That lowers my margins. I'm going to have to increase price. Or if I reduce the number of siblings that are allowed to be available, then I need to find more donors. I need to potentially be more predatory to more 18-year-olds. And that's going to increase my price and or some of the ethics around how I get donors. Do you have any thoughts about the unintended consequences of some very real, and by the way, I want to underscore, I believe in all the things you're fighting for, but those too have unintended consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they absolutely do. And I know the ASRM is really latched on to that narrative of it too. But, again, we are, once again, the conversation, what is missing is the donor conceived person. Where are they in the conversation about doing what is best for them? Where's the trade-off that, yes, it may be more expensive, but this is in the best interest of a child that grows up to be an adult. And this is in the best interest of them. But also, what is the cost analysis breakdown? Why is it so expensive? If you have a donor that comes in and he gets paid $100, why is that one vial of his sperm, and you can get 6 to 9 of the vials? Why is one vial $1,800?
Right.
If they're not doing the verification, is that overhead? And as a parent, I think that a lot of us would agree that we would pay a little extra more to make sure that it's the donor gametes that we want, that it's the correct medical information or criminal history report or something. I think that, a lot of us would agree that if we're already paying $1,800, what's $1,900 at this point? And I hate to say that because it's predatory on the demographic that has to use artificial reproductive technologies. But also, once again, putting it back onto the fertility industry and those sperm banks. How are they not cutting costs, but how are they bringing costs down for them so that they don't in return give it to their clients? How
Absolutely.
are they making?
That's right. There's no transparency.
Yeah.
Well, so we're layering your personal journey and your advocacy journey simultaneously in a very short conversation. How have both shaped your perception of what a family is?
I think before, just talking about a family, it's just, my own personal projection of, what my family is. But now I am so much more aware of the different language that I use. Obviously, I have to say social children or social sibling, half siblings, whole siblings, donor deceived siblings, donor conceived siblings. Obviously, those definitions are so different. But also, I think I'm just so much more aware that there are so many different ways to have a family. And there's not a right way to have a family. And just normalizing that. And chosen family is also so important. Mm-hmm. And chosen family isn't really important to me. Steve is my chosen family now, right? So I think that that's how it's probably changed the most, is just the different words that I now have to use, but then also the acknowledgement and acceptance that there's space for every one of these people in my life and in my family.
I love that. And I love that you're calling out the man who was at one point the person you thought was your dad, your biological dad, and is now a chosen family member. That's really special. Eve, you're doing so much. We've referenced some of the places that we can find more information on the advocacy work that you're doing, your story, etc. If I were looking for more, where do I find you?
So the best place is Instagram, and my handle is Eve A. Wiley, and Wiley is Wiley. That's where I post most of my stuff, especially legislation, calls to action, or just as easy as emailing your legislator, hey, can you support this bill? And then my website is evewiley.com. So that kind of gives more of a background of legislative history in my story as well. But Instagram is probably the best place.
Awesome. And I've loved watching you on Instagram. There's so much I've learned as a result. Thank you so much for joining us. This is really a very special episode.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.